First, about the Equality Act 2010, which has certain protected characteristics. One of those protected characteristics is, of course, sex. And I would have thought that everyone would have assumed you're talking about biological sex, but now activists are saying it's never really meant that. What do you make of that?
Well, it's upside down. That's what I make of it. When the Act was first brought in, it was clear to everybody that that's what sex meant, and that's why there was no need for any further definition of what the meanings were. It was assumed by everyone in society that it meant biological sex. Mm-hmm. And then, since then, of course, we've had the growth of gender ideology and the idea that, from some people, that men can become women and therefore should be should be covered under the protected characteristic of sex as women. Now,
does that mean, though, that if you accept that sort of revised definition of sex that gender ideologues want us to accept, that effectively you can't have female-only spaces by law?
No, you can't. You're allowed, at the moment, the Act allows you to have sex-specific spaces where there is a need. It doesn't say you must have them, but it allows you to have them if a business or a service provider has a need to provide single-sex services, like in care, for instance.
Yes.
That is, it's vital. Well, my own mother had a young man turn up to give her intimate care one day. Fortunately, I was there and was able to turn him away. That was just a man. He wasn't pretending to be anything other than a man. So the idea of self-ID combined with anybody can be, then it gives no meaning to sex-specific spaces.
So, James, can I bring you in on this? Because there has been for a while this legal fiction that when people have a gender recognition certificate, they are treated in the law as though they were the opposite sex, even though nobody was ever seriously suggesting that they've actually changed sex, because human beings can't change sex. So this complicates matters a little bit, doesn't it? Because where does that leave those individuals?
Well, legal fiction is the correct word. You know, we've got the Gender Recognition Act, which allows people to legally change their sex for the purposes of legal documents, etc. But the difficulty we've got is that man-made laws vary from country to country, depending on the government of the day. But laws of science, laws of nature are universal. Sex is binary. Sex is immutable. You cannot change sex. And as a result of this, we need to protect same-sex spaces, same-sex rights. But actually what we've seen, and Heather touched upon this, is a dilution, an erosion of these. And we've seen this culminating in Scotland, where they attempted to push through this dreadful legislation in which someone, on a whim, can decide that they're the other sex. But I think it's crucial to understand that as part of these proposed changes, we will not be taking away safeguards from trans people. There's a protected characteristic of gender reassignment. Nobody's proposing to do anything with that. So it means that if somebody is discriminated against or harassed or victimised because they have reassigned their gender, they will still be protected. So the types of criticism levelled at these proposals is completely unfounded.
That's a really important point, though, isn't it, Heather? Because, you know, I've spoken to people, I've had people online tell me, trans activists, or just trans people, saying that all they want is the right to use the toilet facilities that they feel most closely accord with their sense of who they are, and that they have been doing so for many years before all the kind of debates stirred up. Do they not have a point?
Well, I take issue, first of all, with the idea, and one of the fundamental things about this problem is when we're told that they've been doing this for years. If you're in a toilet as a female in a toilet and a man comes in, no matter how they're dressed, you are not going to challenge that man. Women don't. Women, they go through their lives with their keys between their fingers, watching over their backs, walking on the side of the street with the light on, because it's inbuilt in us that we are at risk, we are at danger. And so you're not going to start an argument or a fight with somebody who is ideally a man and tell them no unless you've got, you know, good backing there.
Yeah.
And it's fundamental to the problem here, and I think so many men don't understand that that's something that women have suffered from through the ages, and having safe sex space is such a relief if you are feeling at all vulnerable. It's to have somewhere to go. And there are women that are far less vulnerable than I am, and I'm fighting to, you know, in hospitals, for instance, in care homes and in prisons.
Yes.
And we're talking about this, and that's a fabulous thing. This time last year, I wouldn't have believed that we could be talking about this and this would have moved forward.
So it's not just a question of safeguarding, it's also a question of dignity.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Because with the safeguarding issue, a lot of people don't understand, I think. They make the assumption that anyone who wants to preserve women's only spaces is somehow suggesting that trans people are more inherently inclined to predatory behaviour. But, of course, that's not what people are saying. They're saying that a minority of people might exploit the loophole of gender self-ID in order to access.
You know, we could talk about you lock your front door of your house, not because everybody passing is going to try and break in and burgle you, but somebody passing might. And it's that concept.
Yes.
As a woman, not every man is bad. Not every man is a rapist, I know. And particularly not every trans woman is going to attack me. But there are a small minority. And we know, also you're talking about the gender recognition bill in Scotland, and when that was stopped, and lo and behold, the next day, the papers are full of a picture of a gentleman who was IDing as a woman to get into the women's estate. This
is Isla Bryson. Yes.
Yes.
Double rapist.
Double rapist. And here we are all over the paper. So this does happen. Yeah. It's not that it's a figment of my imagination. It's not going to happen. And the public outcry. Last year there was a debate in the House of Lords with a lot of members of the House of Lords standing up saying that there was nothing wrong with having female-identifying men in women's prison, the women's estate. And then the public outcry, when this was made evident in the front page of the newspapers, was quite astounding.
But now we have a human rights body stepping in and saying this is the way to go. And that does signify a shift in the public debate, doesn't it? But what's happened there, James?
I mean, the proposals by the Equality and Human Rights Commission are incredibly measured and reasonable. They've not even said, let's change the law. They've said, let's talk about potentially changing the law. Here are the benefits, here are the costs.
Let's have a conversation.
Let's have a conversation that's subjected to proper scrutiny. But the backlash from, I'm going to call them trans ideologues, has been crazy. Baroness Faulkner, the chairwoman of the EHRC, has been called a Nazi and a bigot. I've come across trans individuals online claiming that if this legislation is changed, they won't be allowed to go to the toilet. I mean, utterly farcical and outright lies.
But how do we deal with... How do we have a debate? How do we begin this conversation when there are certain contingents, and I'm not, you know, I'm going to say a small minority of trans activists, the more militant side of that. Most trans people wouldn't fall into this bracket, but who are willing to misrepresent reality, who ascribe false quotations to Baroness Faulkner, to call her a Nazi, for goodness sake. How do you even begin to get around a table with people like that?
I think the unfortunate truth of the matter, Andrew, is that we have to think about balancing rights with one another. But actually, these individuals are not for conversation. They're not for equality. You know, we look at the Equality Act, there's a list of protected characteristics. They seem to only want to put themselves first and, you know, screw everyone else, because they don't seem to care much about the defence and the rights that people of the same sex deserve. But equally, what about religion and belief? I mean, I and other people have been cancelled for daring to speak out and say, we believe that sex is binary and immutable and men are men and women are women. They're happy to have us thrown under the bus as well, as long as it suits their ideological purposes.
And that's a very interesting point, isn't it, Heather? Because, you know, for instance, people who hold a deeply religious point of view, some Muslim women, for instance, cannot be in a space with people who are biologically male and undressing. And yet these activists who are so interested in group identity don't seem to care.
Don't seem to care, nor people for whom English is not their first language, and they're forced to have a think about what does cervix ever mean? Am I one of that great wave, if they even ask that?
Yes.
And the nonsense of the results of the 2021 census that's come out showing just how one or a couple of questions, badly framed questions, has skewed all results from it. So with the end result, there's a huge amount of data that is just has no value.
Because people didn't understand the question.
People didn't understand the question.
Yeah, and that's yeah, absolutely. Sorry,
we're talking about it now. It's got a lot more sunlight on it, and that gives me great hope. And the Sex Matters petition for the defined sex in the Equalities Act, which reached 100,000 signatures, means that there will be a Westminster Hall debate on it. And I look forward to that. It's a long way off changing Parliament, or Keir Starmer's view that 1% of women, or no, was it 0.1% of women have a penis.
I think he's moved on that. I think it was 1%, now it's 0.1%. So he's moving in the right direction there. But yes, that is a very good point, that now, because of the Sex Matters petition, there will be this debate.
There will be a debate.
And so you are...
That's what we've been calling for all the time, but the tactics that have been used have been They've been creeping tactics, shut people down, make them afraid to speak out.
Yes.
And Women's Rights Network, one of the things that we do is encourage people, everybody, to be safer. We've got your back. You can speak out. And it is beginning to happen. There are employee networks in the civil service starting in all sorts of different sectors in the city, for instance, and it's encouraging people. So many people are not bought into this ideology, but they are afraid to speak, which is why politicians can stand up and say, nobody ever talks about it. Keir Starmer this week said, we don't talk about it around the dinner table or at the doorstep or in the pub or the cafe. That's because people are scared. That's the tactics that have been used. No debate, therefore we'll shut you up, we'll get, you'll lose your job, you'll lose your family.
We don't have much time, James, but finally on that point that Heather raises, which I think is a very important point, is the intimidation, the fear. You've had many, many attacks because of your stance on gender ideology. What advice can you give to people when it comes to these intimidatory tactics?
I mean, look, it's horrible. As a Jewish man, I'm being called a Nazi, I'm being sent death threats and all the rest of it. That's unfortunately the norm these days. What I would say is you have to speak out. I mean, these issues are far too important. We're talking about free speech, women's rights, and most importantly for me, child safeguarding. Nothing else can come before that. And so I beg people to take the hit, actually, if needs be. They'll have support. I and others are here to support people, but, the stakes are far too high to stay silent.